Before the crown, before the empire, before the maps of Europe were redrawn by a single man's will, there was a boy. A boy who did not speak French properly until he was 10 years old, who was mocked at school for his accent, his poverty, and the island he came from that most of his classmates could barely find on a map. A boy who had no connections, no money, no family name that meant anything beyond the shores of Corsica, and who sat alone in the cold of French military schools, reading about Caesar and Alexander, and quietly, privately, with the absolute seriousness of someone who has decided something rather than simply wished for it, concluded that what they had done, he could do too. This is not the story of the emperor. This is the story of how he became one. Part 1. From a forgotten island to the moment the world first heard his name. The story of Napoleon Bonaparte's early life is at its core the story of a boy who arrived somewhere he did not belong and refused to leave until it belonged to him. He was born Napoleone Bonaparte on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, the capital of Corsica, an island that had been French for exactly 1 year when he arrived, having been sold by the Republic of Genoa to France in 1768, as casually as one might sell a piece of furniture one has grown tired of. The people of Corsica had not been consulted about this transaction. They had in fact been in active rebellion against Genoese rule for years, fighting for independence under a leader named Pasquale Paoli, and Napoleon's own father, Carlo, had been among Paoli's supporters. When France took over and Paoli fled into exile, Carlo Bonaparte made the pragmatic decision that most men with families and ambitions make when the political wind shifts decisively. He adapted. He learned to work within the new system. He cultivated French connections, and he used those connections to secure a scholarship that would send his second son, Napoleone, to the French military schools on the mainland, an opportunity that was simultaneously the greatest gift he ever gave his child and the beginning of a loneliness that shaped everything that followed. Napoleon arrived at the school of Brienne in 1779, 9 years old, speaking French with a heavy Corsican accent that his classmates found hilarious and that he found humiliating, in the specific burning way that only a proud child can find humiliation. He was small. He was poor by the standards of the students around him, most of whom came from established French noble families, with names and connections, and the easy social confidence that comes from never having had a serious reason to doubt your own place in the world. Napoleon had none of that. He had an accent, a chip on his shoulder the size of the Mediterranean, and a mind that, once his teachers stopped laughing at his pronunciation long enough to actually test it, turned out to be something genuinely remarkable. He was extraordinary at mathematics. He was extraordinary at military history and geography. He read with the focused intensity of someone who has decided that knowledge is the only weapon available to him, and intends to use it without restraint. He did not make friends easily at Brienne. He did not particularly try. He retreated into his studies, into books, into the long private project of educating himself beyond the curriculum, reading Plutarch and Voltaire, and histories of ancient campaigns, and filling notebooks with observations about strategy, geography, and the mechanics of power. When other boys played, Napoleon read. When other boys formed the social bonds that would ease their passage through French military life, and eventually French society, Napoleon sat alone and thought about Julius Caesar. Not admiringly exactly, more analytically, the way a young engineer might study a bridge, not to appreciate it, but to understand precisely how it was built, and whether he could build one better. He graduated from the École Militaire in Paris in 1785, at 16 years old, completing in 1 year a course designed for 2, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the French artillery. He was 42nd in his class of 58 in overall standing, because the subjects that did not interest him, he did not bother to master. But in the military sciences that mattered, he had no equal among his peers. He returned to Corsica on leave and found himself, for the first time, genuinely uncertain about where he belonged. He was too French now for the Corsicans, who resented the occupation, and too Corsican still for the French world that had educated him without ever quite accepting him. He was a man between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, which is perhaps the loneliest position a young person can occupy, and also, as it turned out, The perfect psychological starting point for someone who intends to build an entirely new world of his own.
The French Revolution, when it finally consumed everything that the old world had taken for granted, did not feel like an opportunity to most people living through it. It felt like terror. The streets of Paris ran with blood that belonged to people who had done nothing more dangerous than being born into the wrong family at the wrong moment. The guillotine worked with a bureaucratic efficiency that would have been impressive under different circumstances. The old certainties, the monarchy, the church, the aristocracy, the entire inherited architecture of French society collapsed in a matter of years, and in the chaos that followed, the rules that had previously determined who could rise and how far simply ceased to apply. For a young artillery officer from Corsica with no family connections, no inherited wealth, and no social standing worth mentioning, this was not a catastrophe. It was the opening he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting for it. Napoleon's political instincts in these early revolutionary years were sharp enough to keep him alive, which was not a trivial achievement. He aligned himself with the Jacobins, the radical wing of the revolution, and cultivated a friendship with Augustin Robespierre, the younger brother of the man who was effectively running France by terror. When Robespierre fell in the coup of Thermidor in 1794 and the terror ended as abruptly as it had begun, Napoleon was briefly arrested as a suspected Jacobin sympathizer, held for 2 weeks, and then released, when no one could produce sufficient evidence against him. He had come within a few bad decisions of the guillotine. The fact that he navigated that period and emerged intact says something important about the combination of genuine political instinct and extraordinary luck that characterized his early career. But the moment that changed everything, the moment that transformed Napoleon Bonaparte from a promising young officer into a name that France and then Europe could not ignore, came in the autumn of 1793 at the port city of Toulon. Royalist forces had handed the city to the British Navy, which had moved warships into the harbor and was using them to support the counter-revolutionary cause. The French Revolutionary Army had been trying to retake the city for months and failing comprehensively, largely because the officers in command did not understand the critical importance of a particular hill overlooking the harbor. If you controlled that hill, your artillery controlled the harbor. If your artillery controlled the harbor, the British ships could not stay. If the British ships could not stay, Toulon would fall. It was a straightforward problem once you saw it clearly. Almost nobody in the French command saw it clearly. Napoleon saw it immediately. He arrived at Toulon as a replacement artillery commander after the previous one was wounded, assessed the situation with the focused speed that would become his military signature, and within days had completely reorganized the artillery positions and begun pushing toward the critical hill. His superiors initially resisted. He pushed anyway. He was at the front of every assault, exposing himself to fire with the same theatrical calm he had displayed in his earliest military experiences, leading rather than directing, insisting rather than requesting. When the hill fell and the harbor came under French artillery fire, the British ships sailed within hours. Toulon surrendered within days. Napoleon was 24 years old. He was promoted to brigadier general, and for the first time in his life, the name Bonaparte meant something to people who had never been to Corsica. Toulon changed Napoleon Bonaparte in ways that went beyond the promotion and the recognition, though both of those mattered enormously to a young man who had spent his entire life being told, in various polite and impolite ways, that he did not quite belong where he was trying to go. What Toulon gave him was something more fundamental than rank. It gave him proof. Not the provisional, qualified, still to be tested kind of proof that most young people carry around hopefully in their early careers. The absolute, demonstrated, no longer theoretical kind of proof that comes from having looked at a problem that defeated better resourced and more experienced men, solved it quickly, executed the solution under fire, and watched the result confirm every calculation he had made sitting alone in his tent the night before. He had been right, completely and entirely right, and the world for the first time had been forced to notice. The officers who had dismissed him at Toulon, who had resisted his reorganization of the artillery positions, who had looked at this intense, thin, foreign-accented young man with his rapid-fire assessments and his absolute certainty and seen arrogance rather than competence, those officers watched the British ships leave the harbor and understood something they could not quite bring themselves to say out loud. He had seen it and they had not. He had been right and they had been wrong. That particular dynamic of Napoleon being right in ways that made the people around him uncomfortable would repeat itself for the next 20 years across the battlefields of Europe, and the men who learned to trust it earliest were the ones who rose highest in his service. But Toulon was the beginning of something else too, something that would prove, in the long run, more consequential than any military victory. It was the beginning of the Napoleon myth. Stories about what he had done at Toulon spread through the French army faster than any official dispatch, growing slightly with each retelling in the way that stories about extraordinary people always do. The young artillery officer who had seen what nobody else could see, who had stood in front of enemy fire without flinching, who had solved in days what months of conventional effort had failed to achieve. The French Revolution had destroyed the old aristocracy, and with it the old system of military promotion, based on birth rather than ability, and into that vacuum came the possibility of a new kind of hero, one whose claim to greatness rested not on his father's name, but on what he himself could do. Napoleon understood this instinctively. He had been waiting for a world organized on those principles his entire life. He left Toulon a brigadier general and returned to a France that was still consuming itself, still dangerous, still unpredictable in the specific way that revolutions are always unpredictable when the destruction phase has not yet fully given way to the building phase. He was 24 years old. He had a reputation now, small but real, built entirely on demonstrated competence rather than inherited position. He had survived the terror. He had survived the political chaos of the Thermidorian reaction. He had demonstrated at Toulon the quality that would define everything that followed, the ability to look at a complex situation, identify the single decisive point that everyone else had missed, and move toward it with a speed and conviction that left no room for the hesitation that defeats most men before the enemy gets a chance. The world had not yet heard of Napoleon Bonaparte, but it was about to. Part 1 was over. The real story was just beginning,